you just plug in the inflation rate and GDP, it's already over 2%. The danger is get behind the curve and everybody thinks inflation's too high.
안녕하세요. 글로벌 구루에게 듣는다 시간입니다. 최근 코로나 델타 변이 확산세와 함께 세계 경제 회복의 가장 큰 복병으로 꼽히는 것은 물가 상승, 인플레이션입니다. 막대한 돈을 찍어댄 통화정책이 어떤 여파를 나타낼지, 또 미국 연준은 언제 기준금리 인상에 나설지 시장이 주목하고 있는데요. 오늘 저희는 테일러 준칙을 만든 존 테일러 스탠포드 교수 모시고 이야기 나누려 합니다. 테일러 준칙은 미국 연준이나 한은 등 세계 각국 중앙은행들이 기준금리를 산출하는 데 사용되는 통화정책 운용의 정석과도 같습니다. 테일러 교수가 보는 현재 미국의 적정 금리와 앞으로의 통화정책 변화 전망까지 함께 들어보도록 하겠습니다. Professor Taylor, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here. Thank you very much.
I would much rather be talking to you in person, but unfortunately we still have borders in place right now, so.
Right, well, we can think that we can talk this way anyway, so it's better than nothing, right?
Right. Okay, so let us begin by talking about the state of economy. 네, 현재 미국의 물가에 대해서 파월 연준 의장이 일시적인 인플레이션이다 이렇게 판단을 했습니다. 교수님께서는 어떻게 좀 판단을 하고 계신가요?
Well, I'm concerned that inflation is not so temporary. We've had a pickup recently, but even before that, we've had indicators. Interest rates were quite low relative to where we think they would be based on past experience, and money growth is very strong. So I think it's probably not temporary, be my guess, and so some action of some kind is needed.
코로나 팬데믹으로 세계 각국 중앙은행들이 경기 부양책에 나설 수밖에 없는 상황이었습니다. 하지만 이 역사상 최악의 재난이 무제한 유동성 공급이라는 조금 기이한 경제를 만들어내는데요. 앞으로 어떤 여파를 나타낼 것이라고 보시나요?
I think we do. First, I think the Fed took appropriate actions back in March and April of 2000. There was a very big recession, that's for sure, and it was short, fortunately, but very big, and they took actions. But at this time, that's over a year ago, and there's signs of the economy picking up again. There's growth is strong in the first and second quarter of the year, expected to be strong. So it's time to think about returning to a more normal policy. I think that would be what I would be advising, what I am advising at this point. I think it's certainly time to begin to say we're going to not keep the low rates forever. Now, of course, there's debate at the Fed about that, and I think they've indicated they'll increase a little sooner than later, but there's still no indication that rates would begin to increase or that the balance sheet growth would slow. So far, very little, in fact, has been stated.
미 연준이 테이퍼링을 언급했는데 언제 금리 인상에 나설까요?
Well, I think right now they could begin to raise them already. It doesn't look like they will do that, but they could indicate that rates are coming up sooner, maybe by the end of this year, in the next year. I think it could be earlier than that.
Oh.
So if you look at the longer run, we have the goal is 2% inflation, and you can't have such a low interest rate in that environment. And growth is picking up as well. So the major indicators are that rates should be increased. And even if the Fed would give some indication that that's coming, I think it would be beneficial. People are beginning to wonder why there's no reaction, no discussion, no anticipation of what might happen going down the road.
Okay. Based on your Taylor rule, what is the appropriate interest rate of the United States right now?
Well, first of all, you always have to go in slowly. You don't want to frighten the markets, scare the markets. But if you just plug in the inflation rate and GDP, it's already over 2%. So they should begin to move, and maybe 50 basis points. and then gradually, so that by this year they're becoming normal, because they don't want to be behind the curve. The danger is you get behind the curve and everybody thinks inflation's too high, and then there's a potential for going too far, and then that's not what we want to have. We want to move into a good growing economy with an inflation rate that's close to 2%, which is the Fed's target, and not to cause any disruption. So I think that if they do that sooner, that rather than later, it will be a smoother operation.
교수님께서는 연준이 조금 더 구체적으로 이 테이퍼링에 대한 설명에 나설 필요가 있다고 보시나요?
I think it's possible. I think they're discussing that now. The focus of the discussion is primarily on the balance sheet and the purchases of mortgage-backed securities and treasuries. And so it might be that they give some guidance first on that. They'll begin to reduce the size of the purchases and then follow up with more guidance on the interest rate. I think it would be better if they did both, quite frankly, but it seems like they're going to take one step at a time. But I think it'd be better for the markets. You'd have more clarity, for sure. More clarity if both there's forward guidance on the asset purchases and forward guidance on the interest rate. That would be better.
최근 유럽이나 아시아 등 세계 각국 중앙은행들이 통화정책을 완화해서 긴축으로 전환하는 모습입니다. 현 세계 중앙은행들의 통화정책에 대한 평가도 듣고 싶습니다.
Well, it's a concern. It's always been a concern that central banks, of course, they look at each other, they follow each other. I know the ECB has, now they have an inflation rate of 2% rather than almost 2%. But they've very, very explicitly not gone to this average inflation targeting that the Fed has. The president, Christine Lagarde, has been very explicit about that. So I think that's probably the right thing to do. They have their own policy, and I think other central banks would as well. I do think that there is a concern about a tantrum if we go too far, and because they're linked together. And people are saying, oh, the Fed has moved, you should move. But I think what is interesting now, and this is true of Europe and of Asia, there seems to be looking at each situation. And let's face it, countries are in different situations.
Right.
Africa, India doesn't look like it's out of the water yet.
Will another taper tantrum hit emerging markets then?
Yeah, emerging markets are, especially if you think of India, Africa, parts of Latin America, they are a bit of a concern, and because the pandemic is still there, right. And that's after all the reason the economy has gotten so much better in the U.S. is we've done a good job on the medicine, and countries that have been successful that way have worked out. So you can see in the U.S. there's more relaxation. Businesses are starting to open, schools are starting to open, and so that is really why things are moving. We haven't really seen that throughout the world yet, and I think we need to see that before we know for sure what's happening in other parts of the world.
미국이나 한국의 자산 시장이 크게 올랐습니다. 교수님께서는 여기에 어떤 붕괴될 버블이 있다고 보시는지, 또 투자자로서 좀 주의해야 할 부분이 있을까요?
I don't think they will burst if the policy is sensible and getting back to normal. The markets really don't like surprises, and that's another reason to start moving sooner rather than later so that a big surprise doesn't happen. But I think that if you're looking at what the economies are doing and their recovery, it's faster than the Fed thought, for example, right? And then the inflation rate is picking up, and there's more talk about that. I think a move back towards a more normal policy, and after all, normal policies have worked well in the past, where whether it's a Taylor rule, whatever you call it, there's a methodology. And I think the sooner central banks get to that, the better. Otherwise, this doubt, this uncertainty will continue, and it's not good itself. And you mentioned fiscal policy. Of course, there's a big debate about fiscal policy in the U.S. as well, and so that has to be settled too.
이번에는 한국에 대해서 좀 물어보도록 하겠습니다. 한국의 기준금리는 현재 0.50%입니다. 코로나로 인해서 이제 경제 위기가 심할 것으로 보고 이 금리를 내렸는데 현재 GDP 갭은 마이너스에서 플러스로 돌아섰습니다. 한국의 적정 금리는 어느 정도라고 보시나요?
Well, I think that the Bank of Korea could be thinking about moving rates up too. I know there's lots of questions throughout Asia, and perhaps South Korea has been in a better situation. But it seems to me, 50 basis points, it means it's going to have to increase to some extent already. And so I would say get on with it. The markets are important, and the governor knows about that. But I think it's and my general feeling here is let's try to get back to normal. That is a higher interest rate to be sure, and I think that's the best thing to do now. I think the inflation rate target is whether it's 2%, that seems reasonable. And when you're at a normal thing, you have to have the interest rate somewhat higher than the inflation target.
Right.
People say it's maybe 3%. 4%, but it depends on other things. And I'd say at this point, the direction is important. I think we don't know exactly whether it's 2, 3, 4, whatever it happens to be. We can only look at the past. And of course, people have different interpretations of the past. So I think the most important thing is to get on with it. Don't surprise the markets, don't surprise people. And that would be the key to any change at this point.
코로나 이후에 우리 경제가 이전 수준으로 돌아갈 수 있을지 궁금합니다. 향후 글로벌 경제의 가장 큰 리스크는 어떤 것이라 보시나요?
I don't think the economy will ever be quite the same.
Oh.
There's been fundamental changes, just us talking on the Zoom type of thing, and whatever is new. And the high-tech firms are developing a lot. Education services are quite different. So I don't think it'll be the same. I think there's a real question about what the role of government will be. And it's been a real difference of opinion on this. I do think that some of the advantages that a free market-oriented system, capitalist system generates are very important. We should not move away from that. There's a tendency to think about, especially with the pandemic, that you have concern. But I think we have, going forward, we have an improvement in technology. It's getting better all the time. It was better before the pandemic. I think we need to just stress that, and it would be better if we do going forward.
포스트 코로나 시대로 가기 위해서 필요한 경제 전략이 어떤 게 있을지 궁금합니다. 교수님께서는 그동안 좀 더 명확한 경제 전략이 필요하다 이렇게 강조해 오셨었는데요.
No, I think it's very, in a way, it's simple. Good monetary, good fiscal, good regulatory, good international. But the question is, what is good? And there's debate about that. So my sense, if you look at history, and I would like to see the U.S. economy growing more rapidly, that means we have to have a good monetary policy like we're talking about. But also the fiscal policy, we have large deficits being debated and planned, and we don't know where the U.S. will go on that. But I think it's time to really rein in a little bit the so-called stimulus packages. Perhaps the most important thing is regulation. It seems like it's far from the current discussion, but there's a lot of talk about re-regulating firms, and there's concerns of international concerns. There's concern about the high-tech firms. Even within the U.S., there's firms leaving California because the regulations are too high.
Right.
So I think this is something which is very important for people to understand. The pandemic has been a terror. It's a terrible. But in some sense, the discovery of the vaccine is the market's working. It's encouraged with government. But going forward, a more open-oriented, I'd hate to see international policy become less open, and that would be bad for everybody. So I think the basic strategies are fine. We get back to those basic strategies and recognize it's a different world, and the pandemic has changed things, and communication is different. And by the way, better communication is good. People will learn how to do things better no matter where they live.
성장을 저해하는 규제를 좀 개혁해야 한다 이런 말씀을 해주셨는데 조금 더 자세한 설명 부탁드립니다.
Yes, I can. So just maybe the example of the high-tech firms, a lot of them are close to where I live in California, but you have Google and you have Facebook and you have Twitter, Apple, and there's a large amount of criticism of the firm. Sometimes it's because they don't allow enough freedom of speech. Sometimes it's because they restrict output too much. But the evidence is really still quite vague and informal. But there's a real effort to try to re-regulate them, to even break them up. And this is true of firms around the world. And so I think that would be the thing that you need to be careful of. On taxes, I'm of the view that we don't really need a big higher tax system. We're financing a tax system. I think the reduction in the marginal rates in the U.S. in recent years was good, so I'd hate to go back on that too much. It could be that it would make things worse rather than better. But maybe one thing to say, I think as we come out of this pandemic, we want to think about good growth, and we want to think about affecting growth that affects all people. The pandemic has revealed a disparity among education and among differences. So we want to use what we've learned in this to improve society. And to me, that means a higher growth rate, quite frankly, because people benefit from that, and also a more sensible distribution of goods and services, whether it's education or regulation more generally. So a lot of things to do, but it's an exciting time.
네, 마지막으로 저희 시청자들, 한국 투자자들을 위해서 조언 한마디 부탁드립니다.
Yeah, well, I think it's like every country in the world, it's been a struggle, but it's been positive. I think that you're in the part of the world which is a lot of uncertainty about what's going on in China and the U.S., which is the way to go. But I think the advice is to don't let what happened in the pandemic distract us all from what works, what makes for good policy. And South Korea has been a terrific example in many respects. So we don't want to go back on that. And I think it may be harder to see at this point because everyone naturally focuses on the harms and the terrible situation. But there's some good things. I think this way we can communicate more broadly is a remarkable thing because no matter where you are, you can find the best way to do things, and you can be anywhere in the world, and that's a real positive sign. And I think that's a lesson for Korea, for every country in the world.
Thank you for being with us today. I hope all is well. 테일러 교수는 오늘 팬데믹에서 벗어나 지속적으로 경제가 회복할 수 있는 통화정책으로 돌아가야 한다고 강조했습니다. 그 시기가 늦지는 않았지만 임박했다고도 했죠. 앞으로 다가오는 세계 각국의 변화들을 주목해야 할 때인 것 같습니다. 함께해 주신 여러분 고맙습니다. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.